So you want to own a pipeline, not shares in an energy fund. The actual line, steel in the ground, running for hundreds of miles under farms and rivers and somebody's back garden. On paper, it is the most beautiful business ever drawn. Product goes in one end, product comes out the other. Nobody walks in. Nobody complains about the decor. There is no storefront, no staff on a shop floor, no seasonal rush. Just a buried tube quietly charging rent on everything that passes through it. That's the dream. Here's the reality nobody puts in the brochure. You do not own the ground your pipeline sits on. Almost none of it. What you own is permission, granted by hundreds of separate parties, and any one of those permissions can be pulled after you have already spent the money. So what does a line like this cost to put in the ground? Who actually pays you, and for what? Why the biggest check you receive has nothing to do with how much product moves, and why one of the largest energy companies in America spent years on a project and ended up with nothing. First thing to understand, you rarely buy a pipeline the way you buy a building. Existing lines almost never come up for sale on their own. They move as part of a company or as a package deal, and the seller usually knows exactly what it is worth. So most people who want a pipeline end up in the other market. They build one. That is a completely different animal, and the price range is brutal. Take the Mountain Valley Pipeline, 303 miles of natural gas line, running from West Virginia into Virginia. Announced in 2014 with a price tag of $3.5 billion and an in-service date of 2018. Work out what that means per mile. Around $11.5 million for every single mile of pipe before anything went wrong. Now the other end of the scale. The Trans Mountain system in Canada runs about 700 miles from Alberta to the coast of British Columbia. That original line was built in 1953. When the owner decided to twin it, the expansion was estimated in 2013 at 5.4 billion Canadian dollars. Hold on to that number. We come back to it, and you will not believe where it lands. There is a third way in, and it is the one most people never think about. Sometimes an owner wants out so badly that a government steps in. In May 2018, Kinder Morgan walked away from the Trans Mountain expansion because of political and legal opposition. The Canadian federal government bought the existing pipeline and the expansion company for 4.5 billion Canadian dollars. Read that carefully. A government paid 4.5 billion to own a pipeline that a private company no longer wanted to build. Now, what does the top of this market look like when it works? The Colonial Pipeline runs 5,500 miles from Houston, Texas, up to Linden, New Jersey. It carries more than 100 million gallons of fuel a day, roughly 2.5 million barrels, and by the company's own account, that is about 45% of all the petrol, diesel, and jet fuel consumed on the eastern half of the United States. One privately held company, half a continent's fuel. So the tiers run like this. A short gathering line off a single field, single-digit millions. A regional transmission line, hundreds of millions to low billions. A system that a whole region depends on, tens of billions, and it will almost never be for sale. But there is a split inside this market that matters far more than size, and getting it wrong is how people lose everything. There are pipelines that exist, steel in the ground, permits issued, product flowing, shippers already signed, and there are pipelines that are a route on a map, a stack of applications, and a promise. Those two things get discussed with the same word. They are not remotely the same asset. One is infrastructure. The other is a lawsuit waiting to be filed. Say you get one. Here is what comes attached. Start with the ground, because this is the part that surprises everybody. You almost never own the land your pipeline crosses. What you hold is an easement, a legal right to run pipe across somebody else's property, negotiated one landowner at a time. A 300-mile line can cross well over 1,000 separate parcels. Every one of them is a person who can say no. So how does anybody ever finish a line? Because federal approval comes with teeth. Once a gas pipeline holds a certificate from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it gains the power of eminent domain. It can go to court and take the crossing. That power gets fought. 6 landowners in Southwest Virginia took their case against the Mountain Valley Pipeline all the way up, arguing that letting a for-profit company seize private land was unconstitutional. In May, 2024, the Supreme Court declined to hear it. The pipeline crossed their land. Next, the permits. And this is the real inheritance. A single interstate line needs a certificate from federal energy regulators, a water crossing permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, a biological opinion from the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Endangered Species Act, rights of way from the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management if it touches federal land, a right of way from the Park Service if it crosses a parkway, and water quality certification from every state it enters. Count them. That is 7 separate approvals from 7 separate agencies, and each one can be challenged separately in court. You are not buying one permission. You are buying a chain, and a chain fails at whichever link somebody attacks. Third thing you inherit: the price you are allowed to charge. On an interstate gas line, you do not set your own rate. Your tariff is filed and regulated. What you can collect, how you collect it, even how much of the electricity cost you may pass through to shippers, all of it lives in a document sitting on a regulator's desk. And fourth, a permanent legal duty to the steel itself. Inspection runs, corrosion protection, patrols, leak surveys, repairs. Not when convenient. Forever, on a schedule, with penalties. That is what transfers. Now, let's talk about what arrives. Number 1, and this is the layer that makes the entire industry work: the reservation charge. Here is how a firm transportation contract is built. A shipper who wants guaranteed space on your line signs up for what regulators call firm service. And firm service is a 2-part rate. Part 1 is a reservation charge. The shipper pays that just to hold the capacity, to know the space is theirs on any day they want it. Part 2 is a usage charge, based on what actually moves. Now look at Part 1 again. The reservation charge is paid for the reservation, not for the barrel, not for the cubic foot, for the right to have the space available. Number 2, the usage charge on top, on whatever volume actually moves. Number 3, interruptible service. Whatever capacity your firm customers are not using on a given day, you sell to somebody else, at a 1-part rate, with no guarantee. If a firm shipper needs it back, the interruptible customer gets bumped. That is unsold inventory turned into revenue, on a line you were operating anyway. Number 4, what sits at the ends? Storage tanks, terminals, the place where product changes hands. Owners of long lines are usually landlords at both ends of them. Number 5, the corridor itself. A pipeline right-of-way is a continuous protected strip running for hundreds of miles, and older or lightly used lines get repurposed for fiber optic cable, electrical conduit, and water lines. Steel may be finished carrying product. The route is still worth money. Here is what all 5 look like when they land. Trans Mountain sold much of its expansion capacity to major producers on 20-year contracts, and the company said the completed project would generate around 1.5 billion Canadian dollars a year in cash flow. 20-year contracts, signed before the oil ever moved. Now, about that first layer, go back to the reservation charge, because there is something buried in the regulator's own description of it that most people never notice. Federal regulators describe it plainly. Shippers who want firm service pay reservation charges, and those charges are what allow the pipeline to recover all of its costs of providing the service, plus make a profit. All of its costs, plus profit. Now put that next to the definition of a reservation charge, which is a payment for holding capacity rather than for moving volume. Listen to that again. The payment that covers all of your costs and your entire profit is the payment that does not depend on anything actually flowing through the pipe. Volume is upside. Volume is the tip. The business itself is a landlord collecting rent on empty space, and the tenant pays whether or not they show up. It goes further. If a pipeline is unable to deliver firm service because of an event outside its control, it owes the shipper credits back against those reservation charges. But that obligation kicks in only after a safe harbor window that can run up to 10 days. So a short outage does not automatically cost you the rent. That is the machine. Long-dated contracts, a charge that ignores volume, and a cushion built in for the days you cannot run. Which raises an obvious question. If the revenue side is that protected, how does anybody lose money on a pipeline? They lose it on the way in. Almost all of it. Watch what happens to a construction budget. Back to Mountain Valley. Announced at $3.5 billion. In service 2018. Ground broke in 2018. By the time gas finally flowed in June 2024, the reported cost had climbed to $7.85 billion. Then, a regulatory filing that November revised it again to $9.6 billion. 303 miles, $9.6 billion. Call it $32 million a mile, on a project budgeted at 11.5. 6 years late, nearly 3 times the price. Now the Canadian one, and this is the number I told you to hold, the Trans Mountain expansion was estimated at 5.4 billion Canadian dollars in 2013. Kinder Morgan's own figure in 2018 was 7.4 billion. By 2020, it was 12.6 billion. By May of 2023, it was 30.9 billion. Final figure came in around 34 billion Canadian dollars, more than 6 times the original estimate. Oil started moving in 2024, 71 years after the first shipment on the original line. So that is the capital side. Now the running costs, which are quieter but never stop. Compressor and pump stations burn enormous amounts of electricity, and on a regulated line, that power cost is a defined line item with its own rate, passed along under the tariff. Then inspection tools sent through the line to look for corrosion and cracking, cathodic protection to stop the steel rusting from the outside in, patrols along the route, vegetation control, leak surveys, repairs on a schedule that does not care what your quarter looked like, and a category that did not exist for most of this industry's history. On the 7th of May, 2021, an employee in the Colonial Pipeline control room found a ransom note on a computer screen. Attackers had taken roughly 100 gigabytes of company data and locked systems down. By 6:10 that morning, the entire pipeline was shut off. First full shutdown in its 57-year history. Colonial paid 75 Bitcoin, worth about $4.4 million, the same day. Justice Department investigators later clawed back around 2.3 million of it. Main lines were down from the 7th to the 12th, with normal operations reported back on the 15th. 5 days of stoppage on a line carrying nearly half the fuel for the eastern United States. $4.4 million is a rounding error to a company that size. What it bought was time, and time was the only thing that mattered. But the biggest running cost on a modern American pipeline is not steel, or power, or ransom. It is lawyers. Here it is. The trap that catches nearly every pipeline that fails. You are not buying a route. You are buying a stack of permissions, and any single one of them can be vacated by a court after your money is already in the ground. Mountain Valley is the case study, because the record is a matter of public documentation. The Army Corps authorized its water crossings under a general permit. A federal appeals court rejected that approach, twice, in 2018 and again in 2020. So the project went back and applied for an individual permit instead, which was not issued until June 2023. The Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management approved rights of way across federal land. The same court vacated those and sent them back. Twice, in 2018 and 2022. The Fish and Wildlife Service issued a biological opinion in 2020, vacated in 2022. A revised one came in March 2023. Watch the pattern. Nobody ever told that pipeline no. It kept being told, do that again. And every do it again is another season of idle crews, idle equipment, and interest running on borrowed money. So how did it ever finish? Congress passed a law. In 2023, a provision inside a federal debt ceiling bill ordered the remaining federal approvals to be issued and directed that pending challenges before that appeals court be dismissed. Gas began flowing on the 11th of June, 2024. Sit with what that means. The largest gas pipeline project in the eastern United States could not be completed by its owners, its contractors, or its regulators. It was completed by an act of Congress. That is the trap. On any other asset, you can work harder and fix it. Here, the thing standing between you and revenue is a court order, and you cannot outwork a court order. None of this is new. The very first man to do it got exactly the same treatment. In January 1865, a place in northwestern Pennsylvania called Pit Hole was nothing. Woods and hills. Then drillers hit gushers, and by September an estimated 15,000 people had poured in. Getting oil out was the problem. Teamsters, The men with horses and wagons held a total monopoly on moving barrels, and they knew it. They charged $3 or $4 a barrel. Oil was selling for around $5. Sometimes more than half the value of the product went to the man carting it. Samuel Van Syckel was an oil buyer working the region, and he had a mechanical streak. He looked at the wagons and decided the answer was a pipe. He raised $100,000 from a bank. In 5 weeks, he laid about 5 miles of 2-inch wrought iron pipe in 15-foot joints, some of it buried, some of it on the surface, driven by steam pumps. In October 1865, it started running. Around 80 barrels an hour. To match that, the Teamsters would have needed roughly 300 wagon teams working a 10-hour day. Then he set his price. $1 a barrel, against their 3. Teamsters came for the pipe with pickaxes, horses, and chains, and tore it out of the ground. Van Syckel rebuilt it, hired armed guards, and got the sheriff to post men along the line. The oil kept moving. Estimates say 500 Teamsters were out of work within 5 weeks. Inside a couple of years, pipelines ran all over western Pennsylvania. He had invented the business you are trying to buy, and then pithole ran out. Wells declined. In 1866, fires tore through and burned 30 buildings, 30 wells, and 20,000 barrels of oil. The boomtown emptied. Van Syckel made some bad bets and lost his pipeline to the bank. So the man who created pipeline economics did not keep the pipeline. Read that next to everything else in this video. The asset outlives the owner almost every time. Which brings us to the one that should be taught in business schools. 2014. Dominion Energy and Duke Energy, 2 of the largest utilities in America, proposed the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, 600 miles, from West Virginia through Virginia and into North Carolina. Estimated cost, $4.5 to $5 billion. Planned in service, 2019. Then the permits started falling. 8 of the required approvals were vacated by courts or suspended by agencies. Cost guidance climbed to $8 billion. In service slipped to early 2022, a delay of nearly 3.5 years. And then something happened that looked like total victory. On the 15th of June, 2020, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the project's favor, 7-2, on whether the pipeline could pass beneath the Appalachian Trail. Its developers had won at the highest court in the country. 20 days later, they quit. On the 5th of July, 2020, Dominion and Duke canceled the Atlantic Coast Pipeline outright. What broke it was not the case they won. A federal district court in Montana had struck down the general permit used across the country for water and wetland crossings, and on the 28th of May, an appeals court signaled that the challenge to that ruling was unlikely to succeed. That reopened a question the project thought it had settled years earlier. 6 years of work, billions committed, 0 miles in service, nothing to sell, nothing to lease, nothing to hand to anybody else. And note who this happened to. Not a first-time developer, not a small operator, 2 enormous, experienced, publicly traded utilities with everything a project could want, including a Supreme Court ruling in hand. A pipeline that is never finished is not a bad investment. It is not an investment at all. It is a whole. So who wins here? And what do they do differently? Habit 1. Buy steel, not maps. An operating line with issued permits and flowing product is a different species from a proposed route. Every disaster in this video happened during construction or permitting. Almost none of them happened to a line already in the ground. Habit 2. Sign the shippers before you sign the contractors. Long-dated firm contracts, with reservation charges, locked in before the first weld. Trans Mountain had 20-year agreements with major producers. That is not a nice extra. That is the only thing that makes the money bankable. Habit 3. Route around the courthouse. Every federal land crossing, every stream, every protected species, every national trail is a separate legal front. 2 extra miles of route that avoid a national forest can be worth more than any efficiency you gain going straight. Habit 4. Match your money to a slow schedule. Assume delays, because delays are the base case in this business, not the bad case. Debt that must be refinanced on a fixed date will not survive a court sending you back to redo a permit for the second time. Habit 5. Treat integrity and security as revenue protection. Your revenue is contractual, and it is protected while you can deliver. Anything that stops delivery long enough eats into that protection. Colonial spent $4.4 million in one morning to shorten an outage, and given what was flowing through that line, it was arithmetic, not panic. Two honest scenarios. Start with a good year on a finished line. Reservation charges arrive from every firm shipper on schedule, and they do not move with volume. Usage charges land on top of that. Spare capacity gets sold as interruptible service. Your costs are largely fixed, so most of what comes in above them drops through. That is why this asset class trades like a bond wearing a hard hat. Now a bad year, and here is the twist. A bad year is not a demand problem. Volume falling does not hurt you the way it would hurt a shop, because the reservation charge is not tied to volume. What hurts you is a permit vacated, a route blocked, a schedule slipping while interest accrues. Now the honest scoreboard, and it is not flattering. Canada bought Trans Mountain for 4.5 billion Canadian dollars, then spent to a final figure near 34 billion. Expected cash flow when running, around 1.5 billion a year, divided out. At that rate, it takes more than 20 years of full operation just to cover what was spent building it, before a single dollar of interest is counted. Now compare that to a line already in the ground, with shippers signed, generating reservation revenue from day one, and needing nothing but maintenance. Same industry, utterly different business. So does it work? Yes, and it works spectacularly if you buy or inherit a finished line with contracted shippers. The revenue model is one of the most protected in the entire economy. And no, it does not work if you fund a route. Because a route is not an asset, it is an application. Every owner in this story thought they were buying steel. Van Syckel thought he was buying a shortcut past the wagons. He was buying a war with 500 Teamsters, and he won it, and still lost the pipeline. Dominion and Duke thought they were buying 600 miles of route. They were buying 8 permits, and 8 was more than they could hold. Canada thought it was buying a pipeline for 4.5 billion. It was buying a construction schedule that ran 6 times over. The steel is the cheapest, simplest, most solvable part of this entire business. Anybody can weld pipe. You never bought a pipeline. You bought permission to cross other people's ground, and permission is the only part you cannot build.